You know, Vance, JD, that Vance that's only been a Vance since 2013. Let me just tell you a couple things that are rather interesting about his his story. So I said I'm half Vance. My grandmother was a Vance. My grandmother was my rock. And I ended up going to high school in California because of problems. And it was because of her. And it was, well, I went there not to boarding school or anything, but I had lived with my uncle who was a Vance. If it wasn't, for him, I never would have graduated high school because I was just having a lot of problems, and I don't want to get into all of it, but she was my rock. Her husband, my grandfather, who I didn't know, was Vance, obviously. He was, back in the day, he handled chips, like, I forget what kind of chips, but went on because, as I've said, my family on that side is responsible for, the manufacturing of the box the moon rocks came back in, okay? And so all because of a company my grandfather handed down then to, his son. And but the strange thing is that my grandmother blamed Scientology for my grandfather dying, because when they were living in Chicago, he had a drinking problem, and he had finally quit, and it had quit for a while. But for whatever reason, he kept being pulled back in by these Scientologists, okay, that I think were really government people, because I think that there was some problems he had with stuff. Like he was telling my grandmother that they were capable of doing like flying cars and stuff, that the things that they could do. And yet there was some sort of moral issue he had with it. And then all of a sudden, these Scientologists out of Washington invite him and my grandmother to come to Washington for some Scientology event. And so they go, and my grandmother thought it was all bullshit, but she was a really down-to-earth, like, level-headed woman. I didn't know my grandfather, and so she kept trying to pull her husband. She's like, don't get away from these people. It's some sort of cult. And so they kept, and he was giving them all this money on top of it, and they got him to drink again. They told him that he could control it. So that really infuriated my grandmother. And you want to talk about a woman that has a fire in her. I mean, even at 70, she was driving a red Trans Am. She only had the eagle on the hood removed. So, not because she was trying to be cool. She was very short. The women in my family are very short, and so it was the only car she could reach her feet to the pedals. That was really why. But it just looked funny, She's this old woman riding this red Trans Am. And then she had an IROC. So she was just she was unique in every way. Then, because they got him to drink again, she was furious. So, back in her day, down in Chicago, and they lived on Lakeshore Drive, and so she knew the bars that where the mob hung out. And so she went into a bar because she knew the owner, knew mobsters, Chicago mobsters. And she went up and she said, I'll pay, if you tell the mob, I'll pay them $10,000 to kill L. Ron Hubbard, because he was behind Scientology. She wouldn't have, would tell us the story. But I could understand her anger. And of course the bartender's like, you don't want to get involved with them. Believe me, you don't. So she decided, I'm going to move everybody so these people stop, shaking my husband down. So she moved them to California. They followed them. The Scientology cult followed. And then he eventually died because of alcoholism, not too long after, at a young age. So my grandmother was a unique, amazing woman. And she was my rock, sort of like JD. The whole thing has always been shady to me. Not that it has anything to do with me, just his whole story. That it's really just a story. Supposedly JD and Usha, they had an interfaith marriage. This doesn't look interfaith. But he was apparently not really raised under a denomination, but he basically saw himself as, at least when he was younger, Protestant, and then became an atheist, of course, because, once you go to Yale, I think you get real stupid, but was atheist, then decided in 2019 to become a Catholic because of some Dominican friars. See, it's always a red flag to me that any adult, because once you're an adult, you can look into all the sects of Christianity and make a decision. Any adult that decides to join Catholicism, you're either not really about the faith and you're just about the aesthetics, oh, it looks pretty, or you're about maybe being another religion and you're hiding behind one that's not Christian but calls itself Christian, and that would be Catholic. Because they were married in 2014, I think. And they say it was an interfaith marriage, but I don't know how that really could be. He wasn't really practicing. I mean, it seems to me it was a Hindu marriage, which is fine. But she's really kind of the power behind him, and that's always seems to be what the problem is usually the wives. And many people, said it was an Indian wedding. So why are they saying it's an interfaith wedding when it clearly was an Indian wedding? Well, because he got married in 2014, he really wasn't tied to anything. He was an atheist. So then he became in 2019 because he wanted to present himself to the world that, oh, I'm no longer a never Trumper. But see, if you're a true-blooded Vance, you would have never been a never Trumper to begin with. I think the never Trumpers are always never Trumpers. And ultimately, because I don't believe JD is really a Christian at all, this goes back to something deeper. There's been this whole thing about, that we stole this land from the Indians, even though the Indians didn't own every single piece of it. And yet this is, goes back to Modi and India. And so if you think for 1 minute that Vance is going to be taken over or going to get elected, think again. I mean, I'm a lifelong Republican. But unlike JD, I happen to be a smart Vance. We're kind of known for not believing every little bullshit that the government dishes out. Why did Trump put him as his VP? I don't know. Maybe because he wanted everybody to see who they all are. There's still never Trumpers. That's why Charlie Kirk was so tied to JD, because Charlie Kirk is the one that encouraged Trump to pick JD. And of course, I don't trust Usha Vance at all. I don't trust either one of them. And I think his whole story is bullshit about his life. And it all came from the good old Peter Thiel.